Hey you, and welcome to Restful Thoughts. Tonight, there's nowhere you need to be. Nothing to solve, nothing to finish. Nothing waiting for your intention. For the next little while, you can simply rest. Take a slow breathe in and gently breathe out. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your jaw relax. The desert where I found myself. The night had fallen slowly over the desert, not suddenly. There was no moment when the day simply disappeared. Instead, the last traces of sunlight had faded from the sand one by one, until the horizon became a soft line of violet and deep blue. And then, almost without noticing, the stars appeared. One, then another, and another, until the entire sky was filled with them. You had traveled far to get here, far from the streets you knew, far from the rooms that still carried memories, far from the places where certain songs could suddenly make your chest feel heavy, far from the person you had once imagined would be beside you for a very long time. You had told yourself that you were looking for something, perhaps peace, perhaps a new beginning, perhaps simply a place where nobody knew your story. But somewhere on the long journey across the desert, you began to understand. You had not come here to escape your life. You had not. You had come here to find yourself again. Your small room stood at the edge of a quiet desert village. The walls were warm, the windows small, and outside a single lantern glowed beside the doorway. There was a little light here at first that had frightened you. Back home there had always been something. Streetlights, cars, windows glowing in apartment buildings, voices behind walls, notifications on your phone, things to do, people to answer, thoughts to chase. Here, there was almost nothing. Only the wind, the sand, the stars, and your own breathing. You had spent so long trying not to feel alone that you had forgotten what it was like to simply be alone. And perhaps that was why the first night felt uncomfortable. You lie awake beneath a light cotton blanket listening to the silence. Your mind, of course, did not become quiet simply because the world had. It wandered. Back to conversations, back to memories, back to things you wished you had said, things you wished you had never said, moments you replayed, questions that had no answers. What if? Why? Maybe. If only. The mind has a strange way of believing that if it thinks about something long enough, it can change the past, but the past does not change. And slowly, you begin to realize that you did not have to solve it tonight. You could simply let it be. The next morning you walked into the village. The streets were narrow and quiet. A small bakery had opened its wooden shutters. A woman with silver hair smiled at you as you passed. An old man sat beneath a shaded doorway, slowly drinking tea. Two children ran through the dust, laughing. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. Nobody seemed to need the world to be louder. And somehow, their gentleness made you feel safe. You entered a small cafe. The woman behind the counter placed a warm cup of tea in front of you. You tried to explain that you were only visiting, that you didn't speak much of the language, that you had traveled alone. She simply smiled and touched her hand gently to her heart. And if to say, "Welcome," you smiled back. And for the first time in a long while, you felt something soften inside you. You had expected distance. You had expected loneliness. You had imagined that being far from home would make you feel even more alone. But instead, you found kindness in places you had never known existed. A cup of tea, a smile, a shared table, a quiet conversation. Small moments, simple moments, the kind of moments you might once have overlooked. And you began to wonder, maybe home was not always a place. Maybe home could also be a feeling. That evening you walked farther into the desert. The sun was sinking behind the dunes. The sand became gold, then amber, then rose, and finally deep blue. You found a place between two low dunes and sat down. There was no sound of traffic, no television, no voices, no familiar walls, only the soft movement of the wind. You looked around. For a moment, the vastness seemed almost frightening. There was so much space, so much emptiness. And then you noticed something. The emptiness was not empty. It was peaceful. There was room here. Room for thoughts. Room for feelings. Room for memories. Room for the person you had been. And room for the person you were becoming. You closed your eyes and took a slow breathe in and slowly out. Again, in and out. You felt the warm air against your face, the sand beneath your hands, the quiet beneath everything. And somewhere inside you, a thought appeared, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. I am still here, and everything I am still here after everything. You opened your eyes. The stars had begun to appear. Later at night, you carried a blanket outside. You lay down beneath the enormous sky. There was no ceiling above you, no walls, nothing between you and the universe. The stars seemed impossibly right, thousands of them, perhaps millions. You had looked at the stars before, but never like this. Without city lights, the sky felt endless, almost close enough to touch. You pulled the blanket around yourself, and suddenly you understood why the silence had frightened you. Because silence leaves no distractions. It gives you back to yourself. And you have spent a long time listening to someone else's needs, someone else's voice, someone else's expectations. Meeting yourself again can feel strangely unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean dangerous. Sometimes it simply means new. You rested one hand over your heart. You remembered the person you had been before the relationship, before the heartbreak, before all the compromises, before you began measuring your happiness by someone else's presence. You remembered the things you liked, the places you wanted to see, the dreams you had postponed, the parts of yourself you had made smaller. And you realized you had not lost yourself completely. You had simply been quiet for a while, waiting. The days passed. You began walking before sunrise. You would step outside while the village was still sleeping. The air was cool. The desert was pale beneath the early morning sky. And you would walk. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. You stopped checking the time. You stopped wondering whether someone had written it to you. You stopped reaching for your phone whenever the thought became uncomfortable. Instead, you began listening to the wind, to your footstep, to your breathing, to yourself. And slowly, something changed. The silence that had once felt empty began to feel full, full of possibilities, full of peace, full of you. One evening you met a group of travelers sitting around a small fire. They invited you to join them. There was laughter, warm bread, sweet tea, stories about places you had never heard of. One person had traveled for months, another had left a job behind. Someone else was beginning again after losing almost everything. And you realized everyone was carrying a story. Everyone had lost something. Everyone was becoming someone new. You did not have to explain your heartbreak. You did not have to tell anyone why you had come. You could simply sit here, listening, laugh, be present. And for a few hours you felt completely at ease. Not because someone had rescued you, not because someone had promised you forever, but because you were there. You were alive. You were surrounded by strangers who somehow felt kind, and you were learning that the world was much larger than the one chapter you had just left. The night you returned to your little room, you opened the window. The desert air moved gently through the curtains, and for the first time you did not miss home. You missed certain people, certain memories, certain moments. But you understood that missing something did not mean you needed to go back. You could love what had been and still choose what comes next. You could be grateful for the memories without living inside them. You could forgive someone without inviting them back into your life. You could remember the love without forgetting yourself. And perhaps that was the greatest freedom of all. Weeks later you sat once again beneath the stars. The same desert, the same silence. But you were different. You looked toward the horizon. The darkness no longer felt like something surrounding you. It felt like something holding you. The stars were not distant anymore. They felt like quiet companions. The wind moved over the sand like a soft whisper, and your blanket rested warmly around your shoulders. You thought about the person who had once been beside you. You wished them well, and then you let the thought drift away. Not with anger, not with sadness, simply with acceptance. Because sometimes people are chapters, beautiful chapters, painful chapters, important chapters. But not every chapter is meant to be the whole story, and your story was still being written. You closed your eyes. You listened to your breathing in and out. The desert was quiet. The stars were above you. The fire in the distance had almost disappeared. And you realized something you might never have understood back home. You had spent so much of your life looking for a place where you felt safe, a person who felt like home. a relationship that would make you feel certain, a future that would remove your fear. But perhaps home had never been something you needed to find outside yourself. Perhaps home was the quiet place within you that remained even when everything else changed. You had traveled thousands of miles and somehow you had arrived exactly where you needed to be, here, with yourself, far from home, and somehow closer to yourself than ever before. So tonight, wherever you are, you can let yourself rest. You do not have to know what happens next. You do not have to understand every ending. You do not have to solve tomorrow. You do not have to become someone new overnight. You are allowed to simply breathe, to simply exist, to slowly discover who you are when nobody is asking you to be anything else. And if the silence feels unfamiliar, let it. If being alone feels strange, let it. You are learning, and unfamiliar does not mean unsafe. Sometimes the things we fear at first become the places where we finally feel free. The darkness can be gentle, the silence can be warm, the distance can bring clarity, and the life you thought had ended may simply be making space for another beginning. So breathe in, slowly, and breathe out, even more slowly. Imagine the desert beneath the stars, the soft sand beneath you, the cool night air against your skin, the enormous sky above you, and a warm blanket wrapped around your shoulders. Nothing is required of you here. Nothing needs to be fixed. You are safe to rest, safe to breathe, safe to begin again. And perhaps somewhere beneath all the noise, you are beginning to hear the quietest voice of all, your own, and it says, you are still here. You are enough. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to be happy again. And wherever you go, you can carry home within you. Good night. Let the stars keep watch for a while, and let yourself rest right here. Sleep well.